Well, I think we have an interesting show for you today, a combination of meeting somebody I've looked forward to meeting for a long time, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Dudley Moore, who is a comic actor, currently in Chevy Chase and Goldie Hawn's movie Foul Play, and a substantial amount of our time today is going to be given over to the discussion of a question which, of all the things that people talk to me about, comes up the most: capital punishment. So we'll get into that later in the program. Our first guest, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., son of the late Senator Kennedy from New York, nephew of the late President John F. Kennedy, the first of the younger Kennedy generation to be published. This is his book, Judge Frank M. Johnson, Jr. Judge Frank M. Johnson, Jr. is a longtime political nemesis of Governor George Wallace, certainly on the question of civil rights. Welcome. It's nice to have you with us.
Thank you, Bill.
Bobby.
My pleasure.
Well, I guess it's kind of an interesting experience for you going around talking about this book, which is essentially an elaboration of your Harvard graduation thesis.
That's right.
What drew you into the subject of this judge in the first place, and how can we make him interesting for everybody who wants only to hear things about Kennedy gossip and all that stuff?
Well, I had a general interest in the South when I first decided to do this thesis, Bill. And I had done a junior thesis on Huey Long, and I wanted a comparable Southern figure with some kind of visibility or flamboyance. And I went down to Alabama to write about George Wallace.
When was this? What year?
This was in '76. And I got down there and found out that the man who was really running the state and all the important legislative and executive institutions was a federal judge named Frank Johnson. And during the last 20 years on the bench, he's passed and he's ruled on almost every civil rights issue in the state. He's integrated every school. He's taken over almost every major institution, from voting facilities to jury boxes.
A tremendous record of accomplishment. This is the man whom Jimmy Carter wanted to put in as head of the FBI,
That's
but
right.
he was recovering from a heart operation or something.
That's right.
Yeah. How is he feeling now, all right?
He puts in an 8-hour day, Bill, but I think he still gets pretty tired at the end of it.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the things he's done. From reading in the book and talking to you, he was responsible for trying the last slavery case.
Yeah, that was when he was a prosecutor up in northern Alabama, and actually it's a pretty funny story because there were some slaves some blacks that some brothers called the Dial brothers were picking up in Mississippi from the county jail. They'd pay their bail and they'd bring them over to Alabama, and they'd work them on their farm, and that basically they wouldn't pay them. They sold them their goods. They had a small store there, and so they'd keep them in debt basically forever, and they'd just get more and more in debt. And when the men tried to escape, they'd chase them down with dogs, and they'd bullwhip them, and they killed a couple of men.
What year was this, Bobby?
This was in about '58. And Johnson, when they finally caught up with these guys, they sent some FBI agents in, and they rounded them up. And Johnson had a friend called Elmo Robinson, who was the bailiff at the courthouse. And this guy had a hearing aid. He had a hearing problem, and he had a hearing aid, and he could turn his hearing aid way up and stand next to the door of the jury room, and he could hear everything that was going on in there. And the Dial brothers were up on 3 charges. They were up on peonage. They were up on...
What is that?
They're all basically slavery, involuntary servitude, and slavery. Peonage is just something that's vaguely different than slavery, and I'm not even sure how. But Elmo Robinson was listening at the door just before they brought the verdict in, and he heard the jury foreman said, "Well, I'll never convict a white man of holding a black man in slavery, and this involuntary servitude sounds like the same thing. But I will bring him in on the peonage charge," and that's basically what he got in the end.
Wow. What would you say, I mean, obviously writing a thesis and then having it elongated into a book and getting it published, you really descend into the conscious mind of another individual. How would you say you have grown as a result of writing about Judge Johnson, and how has your thinking been tempered by his thinking?
I think I have a lot more respect for the law and what it can do.
Well, you're going to law school in the fall, right?
And that was partly responsible for that decision. I think I see the Southern view, especially on issues like states' rights. I think I see it a lot more clearly. I really immersed myself in the Southern life for a year, Bill, and I began to see a lot of issues their way, and I think it's you know, the states' rights issue, which I think a lot of us have seen as a code word for racism, really has some political validity of its own, and I think it's too bad that it's been stigmatized by the racial overtones.
Well, what would you say some of our major misconceptions are right now in the North? And you live in New York City, right? Or
Right.
New York. What would you say are some of our major generalized misconceptions are about the South?
I think that I think the racial issue.
I mean, that we think it's really still very, very bad down there?
Well, I think it's bad all over the country. I don't think it's a Southern peculiarity, and I think that's what a lot of Northerners have thought for years, that, you know, basically this was a Southern problem. I think now we're beginning to see that it's a nationwide problem and something basically that my generation's going to have to deal with.
But how do you deal with a problem that is involved with attitudes? I mean, certainly we've had landmark civil rights legislation, no question about that. But when you say it's a problem that your generation has to deal with, if it's a problem of thinking, if it's a problem of feelings of one race toward another, that kind of inequities, how can those problems be dealt with? What tools do we use?
Well, I think it's going to be a lot tougher than, you know, the kind of job that my father or Frank Johnson was involved with. I think it's going to be tougher for my generation, but I think there are certain things that you can do. I think that you have to ensure minority groups or groups that have been deprived because of prior racial injustice. I think you have to give them some outlet, some sense of self-direction, some sense of self-respect. And I don't think you do this just by handing out jobs or welfare money. I think you've got to really strengthen traditional ties, family ties, community ties. What my family was involved with over in Bedford-Stuyvesant, I think, with the community projects and factories that actually have a base in the community, where somebody can go in there and not just have a 9-to-5 job with no hope of mobility.
You know, as you sit here saying this, I'm curious, just a little bit of history on your family in terms of why the Kennedy family has exhibited over the years, through the leadership of your father and your uncle, and certainly Senator Kennedy right now, the sensitivity toward minorities that they have. What in the background, what in the influences, the early influences, has led to that?
I think my uncle, President Kennedy, looked at it as a rational problem, basically, that, you know, this was America, it was a democratic country, and it was one where every man ought to have an equal opportunity according to his ability to better himself. And I think my father probably, you know, my father was a little bit different. I think he really identified with minorities, with deprived people.
Why,
and I
though?
think he had
wonder,
just a kind of compassion that, you know, I think it's too bad it's missing today in American politics. I think that's really what he brought to American politics, a genuine feeling, his own personal feeling of identification that, you know, if there was people in this country being hurt, it took something out of him.
There's no question that, you know, political experts would say that the man who's visiting New York today, President Jimmy Carter, was elected largely because he was able to bring in the black vote, without question. Would you not agree with that?
Yeah.
What would you say his failing has been to black people at this point, midway through his presidency?
I wouldn't cite any particular failing. I think that we're getting some programs right now that might help along. I think that really the main problem is that I think race has to be the major political priority in this country, and I don't think people are looking at it like that anymore. I think a lot of times we see it getting swept under the rug, and that people feel that we've solved some problems and let's go on to something else.
Another thing, just back to the man you write about in your book, Judge Johnson. We have a picture of him here. We can take a look at him. What in this man's background? You know, here's a guy who went to the same law school as his nemesis, George Wallace. You know, why does one man turn out one way and really be a pioneer in his state, you know, in terms of civil rights, and another man just be standing at the school door?
I think it might have a lot to do with the legacy that these men inherited, geographical legacy. And this is what I say in my book. Johnson came from an area of Alabama called Winston County, which was a mountainous county, where they never had any slaves, and they were never really interested in differentiating people by race. During the Civil War, they actually seceded from the South and created an independent country and printed their own currency.
How long what was the country called?
It was called the Free State of Winston.
And how long did this little country...
For the duration of the war. they sent most of their young men to fight for the Union Army.
This is from Alabama. That's an interesting footnote.
That's right. Ever since then, they've been Republican, where the rest of Alabama's been Democrat, and they've maintained their opposition to dominant political trends there. And I think Johnson came out of this area, out of the north of Alabama, and Wallace was coming out of the south, out of an area which has experienced some of the worst racial tensions ever in our country. And they met really in the middle in Montgomery, and really, I think, thrashed out the final battles of the Civil War there.
Very interesting. Let's continue with Robert F. Kennedy, Jr. right after this.